So, welcome everybody. I will just introduce while everybody gets seated. My name is Martin Ådahl. I'm the director of Fores, the think tank where you're right now visiting. It's a think tank working with environmental economics, entrepreneurship, welfare governance, digital rights, many other issues, but one of our absolute main areas is the topic of today, migration. And as director, I'm very thankful that so many guests from far away and also from here in Stockholm have braved this horrible weather. I guess nothing you'd like to migrate to if you didn't have other motives to come here for a very important topic. Because today we are going to discuss labor, as the provocative title says, labor migration. What's in it for us? And to tell us more about for whom and why and how for this eminently interesting study and to present our guests, I will hand over the microphone to the director of our migrations program, Karin Celano. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Again, Mr. Minister, the authors and the distinguished audience, very welcome to Fores and this afternoon when we will attack this subject of labor migration and talk about the economic and to some extent also the political impact on national EU member states in particular. Well, Martin, I have to correct me if I'm wrong, but one reason that Fores migration program was initiated or was migration was identified as a core or key area in 2008 was that it was a response to a growing debate on migration in general, but immigration in particular, but a debate that was more often based on stereotypes and myths and often suffered from a lack of research and facts. And this is true also for the area of labor migration. I mean, it's a highly debated topic, but not so often debated in terms of data and statistics and empirical, based on empirical evidence. So I'm very pleased that you're all here today for the launch of this fantastic study. And I'm happy to have the three authors with me as well. And the seminar will follow kind of I hope logic structure. We will start with the authors themselves presenting their chapters and main findings. We will have a short fika, and after that we will have comments from Minister for Migration and Asylum Policy, Tobias Billström. We have the Counselor Minister and Head of the Consular Section from the Polish Embassy, Ms. Barbara Sosnicka. Yes. Here. And after that we will have a concrete example, or hopefully inspiring as well, from the Swedish labor market on how employers and workers might engage in a dialogue on the issue of labor migration. So to not steal too much time from the facts and the research, I once again want to welcome you all and welcome Eskil Wadensjö, who's written the chapter on Sweden, and let you give your presentation. Welcome.
Is it working?
Okay. Kan testa.
Ja. Can you hear?
Hörs jag? Det gör jag. And then I should try to find my presentation. That's it. Ja, det gör den säkert. ska väl ha den på helbild. Så att, ja, det är det. Thank you very much for the invitation, also for the invitation to this project. And I will first give a short presentation of the Swedish experiences, and start with a short outline of our history. That we have had different labor market policies, immigration policies over time. Almost no regulation up to the First World War from the mid-19th century. But of course many people went out from Sweden instead to the United States. Sweden was quite poor at that time compared to several other countries. And then we had a strict immigration control between the two wars, and then from the Second World War up to the end of the 1960s we had a period of extensive labor immigration. But it stopped. A lot of discussion, and it stopped in the early 1970s. We still have a common Nordic labor market founded in 1954, but very few were allowed to come from other countries for labor migration as labor migrants. But then we have a new situation from the mid-1960s. Sweden became a member of the European Economic Area in 1994, and the European Union in 1995, and of course it made it easier to arrive to Sweden from Western European countries or Southern European countries, and quite a few came actually from the Netherlands, United Kingdom, and Germany especially. And then the next step was that we had introduced no transitional rules for citizens from the European Union 10 countries in 2004, no transitional rules for people coming from Bulgaria and Romania in 2007 and on. And then in 2008, the regulation of labor immigration from non-European Economic Area countries. So what happened? From May 2004, we got increased immigration from especially Poland, but also from the Baltic states and Hungary. And from that we can see also that earlier immigrants are important in determining the composition of migration flows. For example, we had many already in Sweden from Poland, Hungary and Estonia who have arrived in different periods, from Estonia in the 1940s and from Hungary in the 1950s and Poland in later decades. And from 2007 we got increased immigration from Bulgaria and Romania. And then we had a crisis in 2008, and the immigration slowed down. The immigration from the European Union, 12 countries slowed down. Not from all countries. It increased from the Baltic states. Only a little bit it increased. And of course we had difficult problems with unemployment in those countries in those years, and still have problems, but maybe they are declining now. So what do we know? First, about the labor market situation of immigrants from the European 12 countries. And we have a problem here. The employment statistics is not very good, because many people are leaving the country without reporting it, and it means that we have an underreported emigration, and we have an underestimation of employment rate, and it's a serious problem. And of course people are aware of it, and Statistics Sweden is working very hard on it, but it's still a problem. So it means that we in practice don't know very much about the employment rate, but we can see that those coming from European 12 countries are underrepresented in the social transfers programs, and we could guess from that those we are not finding in any registers are not in Sweden anymore. And that's a problem for all groups that we have underreporting. Also for those born in Sweden, it means that our population is not as large as we believe. That's not the problem, but the problem is that some people think that we have a lower employment rate among people born in other countries than we actually have. But we know a lot about those who are employed and those who are in the countries. And I will say a few things about education and wages, starting with that after the sad story about employment. Not a sad employment rate, but sad information. Education first. If you take the situation of those coming from European 12 countries, we find that they have, on average, a higher education than the natives. And that's not surprising in a way, because they are quite young, and younger generations in all countries have usually better education than older generations, longer education. And wages, if you are just comparing the wages, they're slightly higher than for natives if you are comparing the averages. But if you are controlling for education and age and some other things, we get a small difference in the other direction. So we can say that, and when we are studying it, we find that the European Union 12 migrants recently arrived are to some extent overeducated. But the situation is quite different than the situation in the UK, when you have lower wages on average for those coming from the European Union 12 countries. And I guess that one important thing is that we have collective agreements keeping the wages up, and we don't have low wage sectors in the economy in the same extent as some other countries. And something about other things in the labour market. Working hours is almost the same as for natives. Small differences, small variations between different countries of origin. Industry, about the same distribution as for natives. So differences are very small. Of course, there are some differences, and not they are not surprising us, but they are smaller than expected. So we have some overrepresentation in construction, in agriculture, in healthcare and business services. But underrepresentation in public administration, not surprising. Education, not surprising, because it's difficult to be a teacher in the primary or secondary school if you don't have a Swedish language as your, if you don't have knowledge in Swedish language, and also in trade and communication. So, a little bit about the effects of a labour migration on the labour market and the public sector in Sweden. There are some studies. There should be more studies, but there are some studies, and we could say something about it. And wages for natives, we can't see any effects in most countries when we are studying it. There are meta-studies, including many countries. There are some studies indicating that there could be effects in for some parts of the labour market when you have a lot of immigrants coming to those parts. There's a Norwegian study, for example, finding effects in the construction sector. But generally, no effects or even positive effects in some cases. The foreign-born and the natives are mainly complements in the production process, and immigration is also leading to capital import. Employment and unemployment of natives is the same type of results. There's a lot of meta-studies, combining a lot of studies, finding the same results. Public sector finances. We have studies for Sweden covering different periods of from the 1960s on, and we also have studies from other countries. And looking at the effects for taxes and public expenditures. And the main result is that if you have labor migration, it differs from refugee migration, you get more in taxes when you have increases in public expenditures. And of course, it's our system of redistribution is constructed like that. It's going from employed people to those not employed, mainly children and people of old age, but also from those with high incomes and low incomes. And we know that they have about the same incomes, the natives and the labor migrants in Sweden. As mentioned, and it should be mentioned that we also have a new labor immigration policy from December 15, 2008. And a permit is granted if you get a job offer with wage according to collective agreement or at the same level as collective agreement in the agreements in the industry. And the flow has not been very large. Of course, we have had an economic crisis since 2008, and not so good development as in the year before the crisis basis. So about 1,000 permits per month, and mainly specialists and unskilled workers. Seasonal workers have special rules, and many are coming from, for example, India, China, and Ukraine. What we don't know yet is if those people are remaining in Sweden, staying in Sweden, or are going back. Are they coming as skilled Indian IT specialists staying for 6 months or a year, or then going back, or are they staying in Sweden for longer periods? And I think that's very important to study that in the future. So a little bit very short about the data. We have underestimation of emigration, overestimation of the foreign-born population. We also have missing information on short-term migrants, people coming just for a shorter periods and then going back, and we need better statistics on that. And we are also missing some vital information on those working for foreign companies but placed in Sweden, for example, postal workers and those employed by non-Swedish temporary employment agencies. And the future. Is it possible to recruit labor migrants to Sweden in the future? My answer is yes. There are so large wage differences, so if you have vacancies, we will always find workers wanting to arrive to Sweden. And but of course we have a crisis just now, and of course it usually means that we get less of immigration if you get a downturn of the economy. And of course we need to know more about the working conditions for postal workers. And to finalize, I will make some sales promotion for things being published on Thursday next week. First, it's about svensk invandringspolitik under 500 år, 1512-2012 by Julia Boguslav. And then my own Framtidens migration, published by Future Commission. And we will have a meeting on Thursday next week, and we will be sending out information. So, and I'm conclude here.
And before letting Eskil escape, I have one final question. Oh, no final question, but one more question, since I now have Eskil here with me. We've mainly been communicating over email, so I won't let him sit down just yet. What would you say is the most, since we're talking about the need for research and data and knowledge in order for both policy and debate to be relevant and constructive, what would you say is the most common myth about labor migration to Sweden, considering what you've been looking at in this book?
When we are looking at statistics, of course, the main problem is that we don't know very much about the return migration, and that's easy to see that in a way, if you are leaving, it's also for everyone. You have to report it to the tax authority. But when you are leaving, you are forgetting those things, and that's also for those coming from other countries, and it's also those who are native Swedes. They are not reporting it, and you can ask people, have you been abroad for more than 1 year? Did you report that you were abroad, that you moved out of Sweden? And people are not doing it. But that is a problem when you are calculating the employment rates. So, and the employment rates are published by different international organizations and also by public authorities. And people, for example, at Statistics Sweden know that you can't rely on them, but people are relying on them. So that's a problem. And then, of course, we need to follow up what's happened after 2008 with reform. What types of jobs are people coming to? Are they staying on or not? And then of course, we have to speculate what's happening when we get new members of the European Union.
Please, can you speculate? Just a short speculation.
I guess that the next country becoming member is Croatia, and the speculation is that they are not going to Sweden, they are going to Austria and Germany. Maybe a little bit more interesting is if we get Serbia, Macedonia, and Montenegro as members, because there are quite a few people from those parts of former Yugoslavia here.
Networks already.
There are networks, and networks are very important. So it could be something more. But the first out, Croatia, I don't think we will see many from that country in Sweden.
Thank you very much. And now we'll try to pass the microphone on to Martin Roos from Oxford. That's done the chapter on the UK experience that is somewhat different from the Swedish one.
That's it. Yeah, I can just... Right. Okay. Well, good afternoon. Thank you very much for inviting me to be here today. I was given strict instructions to stick to 10 minutes. You've all got the chapter. There's quite a few slides with figures. I'll go through those quite quickly. So what I want to do in the time that I have is talk briefly about the development of immigration policy in the UK in order to give some context to EU enlargement. Then briefly talk about the numbers, impacts, and then to conclude on policy debates. The context to all of this, of course, is that in the UK, for at least the past 12, 15 years, immigration has been one of the most controversial public policy issues. Immigration consistently ranks among the top 3 to top 4 issues of most concern to the public. There's opinion polls that ask people, what are you most worried about? Immigration is always up there. So I'll focus on EU enlargement immigration, but I'll give some context. So broadly speaking, if you want to characterize immigration policy in the UK over the past 10 years, it's a story of opening up and now closing down, closing doors again. The previous Labour government, especially under Tony Blair, believed very much in the economic benefits of immigration. There were a lot of studies talking about economic benefits, and they implemented what became known as the managed migration policy. Starting from the early 2000s, that's quite an aggressive opening to non-EU workers for skilled jobs. Immigration increased quite a lot. When it came to EU enlargement in 2004, a lot of employers were complaining that they found it difficult to fill low-skilled vacancies, because managed migration was about making it easy for employers in skilled and highly skilled jobs. So the UK decided to join Ireland and Sweden in opening up immediately in 2004. And a big part of the reason for doing so was to help fill low-skilled vacancies. Now, the UK government commissioned a study of what was going to happen, how many East Europeans are going to come after 2004, and that study concluded that the inflow would be relatively moderate. They concluded a net migration additional inflow of only about 14,000. So the big story in the UK is that a lot more have come. And there's been a very large inflow, which explains why in 2007 the UK did not open up to Romanians and Bulgarians. So this was a time when immigration was, again, of very high concern to the public. There was a general feeling that the government had not prepared the public for the large inflow of East Europeans. So at that time, the government decided to restrict inflow of Romanians and Bulgarians. Even the business sector was in favor of restrictions, which is interesting, and we can discuss that a bit later. So when the gradual closing down begins with 2008, the UK introduced a points-based system for managing non-EU immigration, which emphasized selectivity much more. And of course, with the new coalition government coming into power, what we now have is, for the first time, is a numerical target for immigration. So the previous Labour government was mainly about selection, select the best and brightest, but no limit. And this government is now setting a precise numerical limit. They want to reduce immigration. And the government is actively reducing skilled non-EU labour immigration, student immigration, and family migration from outside Europe. And they are beginning to talk about whether anything should be done about migration from Eastern Europe. This is broadly some numbers. I'll go through this quite quickly. So the big story here is the solid line at the top is the increase in immigration that I've talked about, from around 300,000 to almost 600,000. So until EU enlargement, that increase was primarily driven by an increase in non-EU immigration. Since 2005, non-EU immigration has broadly remained flat, but the EU inflow has increased. There's a particularly British obsession on with net migration, because the government's target for controlling immigration is formulated in terms of net migration, so that's people coming in minus those going out. Current net migration, the solid line at the top, is just around 200,000, and the government wants to get it back down to less than 100,000, and that's why it's implementing all those policies and reductions of immigration. This just shows the shares of migrants in the population, depending on how you define migrants, almost doubled over the past 20 years. So a huge increase. This shows you the top nationalities by country of birth and citizenship. What's interesting is that Poland, if you define migrants in terms of citizens, non-citizens, Poland is now the top country, comprising 15%. So EU immigration has had quite an impact there. Now this chart shows you inflows and outflows of A8, EU8 nationals. So what I want to say is that the inflow has been much larger than anticipated, much larger. The inflow has been over 500,000, but it has been significant outflow as well. So people think that roughly half of all the East Europeans who've come have since gone back. So there's been significant outflow. At the same time, quite a few have stayed as well. The Polish dominate, followed by Latvia and Lithuania. Almost 2/3 have been Polish. This chart, if you just focus on the shade grey here, that's the employment of East European migrants in the UK. So a very significant increase from 50,000 to over 600,000. What's interesting here is that during the economic downturn, you had a stabilization in employment, but no big decline. And now employment of EU nationals going up again. So it's an increase despite the ongoing economic difficulties. A few characteristics, like in other countries, the employment rate of East European migrants is much higher than most other workers. So they're much more likely to be in employment than others. They tend to be, in contrast to Sweden, they tend to be primarily focused on low-skilled sectors in the UK. The majority are working in low-waged sectors. Now, on average, East European migrants are better educated and younger than UK-born workers. But at the same time, they're much more likely to work in low-skilled sectors. So that means that many East European migrants come skilled to the UK, but work in jobs that do not correspond to their skills. Their wages are among the lowest in the UK because they work in low-skilled jobs. Again, that's the comparison here. That those are hourly wages in pounds. The average is 14. EU8 workers only get about £9 per hour. Now I'll briefly talk about impacts. Obviously there's been a big debate about how East European immigration has affected the UK. I'll focus on the issues that have been most controversial: labour market, fiscal and public services. Now on labour markets there's a bit of a there's an ongoing debate. As in many other countries, statistical studies have found no systematic evidence of any big impacts on wages or employment. Okay, so quite careful econometric work has been done. Obviously there are limitations, all of that, but there's no large studies found. However, at the same time there have been a large number of studies with employers, especially in low-wage sector of the economy. And many of these studies find that employers have developed a preference for employing migrants, including East European migrants, to British workers. I talk quite a lot to employers in different sectors, and many employers tell me they would not dream of recruiting British workers for certain jobs. So there's a big literature about how employers prefer East European workers for some types of work. So there's a little bit of there's a question whether there's an inconsistency in the research. On one hand, you find no impact in the econometric studies. On the other hand, you have all these qualitative studies saying employers prefer migrants. So to what extent these are compatible is a question for research. Fiscal effects, there's only one study that looks at specifically East European migrants, and that study finds small but positive effects. So why are the effects positive, even though most of them work in low wages? If you think, in any progressive taxation system, your fiscal impact will be largely determined by the wage you pay. But the reason why East Europeans are still beneficial is that despite their low wages, they have very high employment rates. They have very high employment. So the high employment rates, the positive effect of the very high employment rates outweighs the negative effect of low wages in terms of the fiscal balance. There's big debate about public services. There's no great studies on this, primarily because of severe data limitations. So the first point to make is when you talk about impact of immigration on public service, it's important to highlight there's two types of impact. The consumption, so the use of public services, education, health, but also on the provision. I mean, certainly in the UK, migrants make quite a significant contribution to providing public services. You know, they work as nurses in the NHS, they work as teachers. The problem with the data is that the UK does not systematically collect information about the use of public services in terms of who people are. So if you go to a doctor, if you register your kid at school, generally you're not asked about your migration status. Sometimes you're not even asked about your nationality. So there's no systematic information about use. The one study that was done, again, finds that in 2009-2010, the per capita consumption of education, health and social care services of recent migrants, including EU nationals, was lower than that of the UK-born population. Now, at the same time, there's been a lot of anecdotes about public services not coping. So while I think it makes sense if you think about the characteristics of East European migrants, they're young, in employment, you know, maybe they're unlikely to be a huge burden on public service. At the same time, immigration growth has been very rapid in the UK, very rapid. And some public services were not funded or prepared well enough. So schools had not got enough money to cater for the large increase in non-English speaking, in children with problems with English and so on. So there's an ongoing debate about funding issues. Social housing, again, research evidence shows quite clearly that East European migrants are less likely to be in social housing than UK-born workers. However, that does not prevent debates about the allocation of limited social housing. For those of you who know the UK a little bit, there's a huge problem in the housing market. Social housing is very limited, huge waiting lists. So in any council will have a problem about how to allocate social housing to a rapidly growing population. There have been a lot of debates about how East Europeans fit into the waiting. So overall, I mean, employers and migrants have clearly benefited. There's no doubt about that. Fiscal effects have likely been positive but small. Most people find small impact. There have been pace of change issues, but I mean that the immigration was unanticipated in the sense that the scale of it and the rapid pace of it. And there's ongoing debates about impacts on specific low-wage labor markets, so this kind of discrepancy perhaps between what employers say and what the studies find. My personal view is that if there are negative effects, they're probably confined to specific low-waged labor markets in specific sectors where East Europeans are concentrated, and there haven't been that many studies. So to conclude, policy debates. Now, for about 30 years, 2/3 of the British public said they want fewer immigration. They want less immigration. So public opinion has for a long time been very hostile to the scale of immigration. That's kind of the background to this. What the public really doesn't like in public opinion polls is migration that's perceived to be out of control. And the public doesn't like low-skilled immigration in Britain, opinion polls. The problem with EU immigration is that it combines two of these things. First of all, even though the EU migrants are skilled, they work in low-skilled jobs. So from the public's point of view, they're often equated with low-skilled immigration. And secondly, there's this element of being out of control. Again, I'm not saying this in any sort of normative way. I'm just saying that's what public comes. So EU immigration has become a problem for public opinion because it's the low-skilled workers and it cannot be stopped at the border. Now, EU immigration has become a major political problem for the Labour Party because it was the previous Labour Party that opened up, and there's been a large increase. And I think large parts of the British public and media are basically saying that it was the Labour Party's fault that this pace of change has happened so quickly. So the Conservative Party, of course, has for a long time said, oh, this is mass immigration, it was a mistake. But 5 months ago, in his first speech on immigration, the current leader of the Labour Party agreed for the first time with the Conservatives that it was a mistake to open up to East Europe in 2004. Of course, a lot of people in the party that were upset about that, but the official party line is now that the UK was wrong to open up. And so the key issue now that I think all parties are thinking about is how do you reduce the rapid growth and the reliance on migrants, especially in low-skilled jobs? If you look at low-skilled jobs, in some low-skilled processing jobs, service sector jobs, the share of migrants in employment has grown from about 8% to 25% within 10 years. So 1 in 4 people doing low-skilled service sector jobs now is a migrant in the UK. That's been primarily because of East European immigration. There's both parties are thinking about whether something should be done about this and what can be done. And there's two alternative policy approaches. So basically, I'm thinking about how do you reduce the increasing reliance on East European migrants in low-skilled jobs? That's the political question, whether we agree with it or not. Conservatives are saying we have to change the welfare system. Welfare system is too generous for British workers. Got to cut benefits. More British workers are doing this. The Labour leader is, I think, possibly, I would argue, picking up some Swedish lessons, in that the Labour leader is arguing that the reason why there's high level immigration in the UK is that we have a very flexible labour market with relatively little regulation of the labour market, including employment agencies. So what the Labour Party, which is still desperately looking for a new narrative on immigration, is now talking about is more regulation of recruitment agencies, more enforcement of minimum wages, in order to perhaps reduce some incentives for labour immigration at the low end. And in a way, again, we can have a debate about this, but if you compare the Swedish and UK experience with labour immigration, of course the countries very different sizes, there's differences in Swedish language, different economies, but still, one of the reasons I would argue why the UK has seen such a large inflow in East European immigration, while Sweden has not, is precisely the difference in the level of labour market regulation. There's nothing that prevents an UK employer to lower wages through immigration, as long as you still pay above the legal minimum wage. I suppose in Sweden, with collective agreements and strong institutions, that's much more difficult to do. So the message that I take away from this is that if you do not have immigration policy that stops people from coming, your labor market regulations still have an important impact on the scale and composition of immigration. Thank you.
So, thank you very much, Martin. So the UK experience differs from the Swedish one in many ways, but in Sweden, from the Swedish debate, something that we've been noticing the last year is that one of the main arguments in the immigration debate is the cultural aspects, that the immigration resistance or the anti-immigration voices, they stress the cultural factor a lot. But would you say that the debate on immigration in the UK, that obviously is vivid, would you say it's a debate mainly about labor migration?
I think, I suppose people have been much more comfortable talking about anything but culture. So it has been a lot about labor immigration. But actually a key issue that's been driving the debate has been a concern about population growth, which I guess is also different. I mean, most European countries are concerned about population decline. The UK is very concerned about rapid population growth. The UK's population is expected to increase significantly over the past 20 years. 2/3 of that growth is because of immigration. And they're the most anti-migration voices, or the most prominent one, has suggested that the population is currently 62 million. There's this prominent line out saying that we must stop the population from ever exceeding 70 million. Now, nobody knows where the 70 million figure comes from, but it's become very prominent in public debates. So this kind of concern about population growth is something that's used. Of course, one has to ask what's behind that. And you could argue that concerns about cultural differences and all of that might be, but generally they're not. Well, they're not explicitly articulated. They may well be behind some of these arguments.
Thank you very much. You all please gather up questions for the authors as well. I think we'll have some time for that in the end. And now to our third author, giving the perspective of one of the major sending countries in the European Union. It's Aleksandra Wojcicka. My Polish it could be improved. Sorry about that. Please, welcome.
So Karin, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. And all right, so the aim of my presentation is to show how emigration, largely post-accession emigration, has affected the Polish economy and labor market in particular. And there has been quite a lot of quite a lot of misconception in Poland that very favorable economic situation after 1st May 2004 is a result of emigration. And I want to show that this is the case only to a certain extent, and that other factors are important as well. So, from the theoretical point of view, emigration can have both positive and negative effects. And I want to focus on a few indicators, which will be the GDP and GDP per capita. From the theoretical point of view, GDP is expected to decrease as a result of emigration, but at the same time, GDP per capita should increase. Also, productivity is expected to increase as capital becomes more abundant in a certain country. The effect on wages can be both positive and negative. We've got positive effects. Well, it all depends on who the migrants are and on the scale of the outflow. So if high-skilled migrants emigrate, the effect on that skill group should be positive. But wages can also decrease as a result of emigration. For example, if industries respond with the change, for example, if the demand declines in certain sectors, wages are expected to decrease. Employment, again, effect can be both positive and negative. Negative effects or positive effect on employment can be where part of workforce emigrate, which can be replaced by other workers in the economy. Sometimes this is not possible, for example, due to structural mismatches between demand and supply, for example, as is the case in Poland. Unemployment is expected to decrease if workers are recruited from among those who are unemployed. The other effects are skills shortages and the inflow of immigrants. Okay, so I'm going to elaborate on it a bit later. Remittances, again, the effect can be both positive and negative. For example, the inflow of money from abroad can reduce work effort in the country and contribute to lower participation rates. But on the other hand, remittances can be important for consumption and investment in the country. High-skilled migration, again, both positive and negative effects. Positive effects are mostly connected with transfer of technology, know-how, and also if, for example, when workers see that there are higher returns to skill in destination countries, they are likely to invest more in education. Negative effects are mostly connected with the loss of valuable human capital and also fiscal loss. So this is just an outline. So, according to the economic theory, we cannot say if the effect will be positive or negative. They depend on a number of factors, like the size of the outflow, skill composition of migrants, and as well as the structure of the economy. Okay, so I will start with briefly outlining developments on the Polish labor market after 2004. So, as you can see, labor market trends are mostly positive. Employment rate has, declined because it's growing again immediately after 2004. Participation rates increased, wages increased, and they peaked. The wage growth peaked in 2007, and also a number of vacancies increased after 2004 and peaked 2007, 2008. And it is important to know that vacancies are mostly focused on two sectors, which is construction and manufacturing. And this is quite important because these are not high-skilled workers who are in demand, maybe with the exception of certain occupations. Okay, so development of emigration from Poland up to 2004. So emigration from Poland in the post-accession period is not something new, because Poland has traditionally been a net emigration country, and it still is one of the few countries in EU which remained net emigration countries. So what you can see here is the development of emigration up to 2004. So large emigration from Poland occurred up to the Second World War. After the war, emigration was curtailed as a result of the communist rule. In the 50s, only a few people emigrated from Poland, with two exceptions, which was the emigration of German minority as well as Jewish minority. So these were two exceptions in the 50s. As restrictions on leaving the country were reduced in the 60s and 70s, emigration picked up. But mass emigration from Poland occurred in the 1980s. During that period, more than 1 million people left Poland permanently, and another 1 million went on a short-term basis. So what happened to emigration after the fall of the Iron Curtain in 1989? Emigration was no longer politically motivated. And what is interesting to note is that emigration actually declined after 1989, although restrictions to movement were lifted. Why? It declined because it was possible to cross the border, so short-term migration increased during that period, mostly circular and seasonal migration. Seasonal migrants were mostly to Germany. It was a result of bilateral agreements between Polish and German governments. Migration from Poland increased again from 1997 as the economic situation in the country worsened. So what happened after 2004? Migration flows were redirected from traditional emigration countries from Poland, which are Germany, USA, Italy, Canada, towards new EU destinations like United Kingdom, Germany, and Ireland. Okay. So what you can see here is the temporary emigration from Poland, mostly in the post-accession period. And emigration increased dramatically after 2004 and peaked in 2007. So period after Poland's accession to the EU can be divided into three phases. So in the first one, emigration increased dramatically, then it decreased as a result of the economic crisis in Western Europe. But now, as economic situation in Poland is getting worse, emigration picked up again. Okay, so who emigrates from Poland? This will be mostly men. Well, 65% of migrants are men. Average age of migrants dropped to around 30. Migrants with higher levels of education are overrepresented among post-accession immigrants. So around 20% of migrants would have high skill or university diploma. And migrants are mostly recruited from among the unemployed, but also employed on temporary contracts. Okay. So, the share of, okay, this is not that, okay, sorry. So sorry, something is wrong. I do not have this graph in my presentation, but so what I wanted to show is, but unfortunately the chart is gone. So what I wanted to show you is that the share of high-skilled migrants differ between countries. So around 30% of migrants in the UK and Ireland are high-skilled compared to less than 5% in the Netherlands. Well, unfortunately, my graph is gone. Okay. Nice. Okay, so now about the impact of emigration on economic aggregates. So what you can see is that the GDP declined in Poland after 2004, and in the short run it declined by less than 1%. Less than 1%. Okay, in the long run it's almost 2%. But as you will see later on, this loss has been compensated by the inflow of remittances. So, and Poland is the country in which the drop in GDP has been the biggest of all EU 8 countries. GDP per capita increased in the short run. In the long run, the effects are mostly negligible. Unemployment decreased by around 0.5% in Poland. But emigration affected different skill groups to a different extent. So the wages of those with high-skilled increased compared, for example, to low-skilled workers. But it also depends on the data use, so effects can be quite different. Okay. High-skilled emigration. High-skilled emigration from Poland has been mostly described as not as brain gain, as it is usually the case, but as brain overflow and as brain waste. Why? Because, okay, it's dropping again. Okay, because most of the workers in source countries undertake employment below the qualifications. So, okay. So this is because of my hair, probably. Yeah, but I think it's not still working. Okay. Thank you. Yes. So as it has been described both as brain overflow, as brain waste and brain overflow. Brain overflow takes place because human capital cannot be effectively utilized in a source country. So there is a problem with structural mismatch between demand and supply in Poland. Okay, so but it does not refer to the whole to all occupational groups. When you look here at this chart, it shows the stock of Polish medical doctors in major destination countries. So as you can see, the stock amounts to around 5,000 people. And the Polish government has been largely apprehensive about this phenomenon. Therefore, the wages of doctors have been increased after post-accession period. Remittances. Remittances from Poland increased dramatically in the post-accession period, but as a share of GDP, they are not. The effect is not that spectacular. In 2006, 2007, when emigration peaked, remittances amounted to 2.5% of Poland's GDP, which is not much compared to other sending countries. But remittances have had important effect on investment and consumption in Poland, as well as on they have been important on regional and on regional scale. So in some areas, in some districts in Poland, where from which emigration have been high, remittances have contributed to the development of these areas. Okay. Yes, another effect is the inflow of immigrants. What you can see here is that the number of immigrants in Poland is quite low. In 2002, the Polish census showed that only 40,000 foreigners stayed in Poland permanently. In 2011, that number was 63,000, so there is an increase of around 1/3. But it is important to know that immigration to Poland is mostly of temporary character. And you can see here the development of Polish policy with regard to the access of foreigners to the Polish labor market. So until 2006, immigration, there was a restrictive policy with regard to the access of foreigners to the Polish labor market. It changed in 2006 as a result of vacancies on the Polish labor market. And the citizens of three countries, Ukraine, Belarus and Russia, could and still can work in Poland without a work permit up to 3 months in a 6-month period. And that regulation was amended later on. And now the citizens of 5 countries can work in Poland without a work permit for maximum 6 months a year. Okay. In 2012, the Polish migration policy was adopted. This is the document which sets out basic recommendations for Polish immigration policy. Okay, and I think this will be all. Well, thank you.
Sorry, just one question for Alexandra as well. I know you write that in your chapter, and we also talked about this, that migration has almost been a non-issue in the Polish political
immigration.
Yes, in the political debate.
Well. Yeah.
But is this changing now? I mean, it's considering what Martin, not the least, was talking about. It's interesting from a Swedish perspective. So would you say that that's slowly changing now with these large outflows of young Polish workers?
Immigration policy is changing?
No, if the debate on migration is there growing interest in migration issues?
No, not anymore.
No?
Not anymore, because as you can see, well, you can not see here it from this data, but the number of return migrants is growing in Poland. So there is now more focus on immigration policy, how to attract immigrant workers, at least in research community. Yeah, but also politicians are starting to talk about that.
So thank you very much to our 3 authors, and I invite you all to have some coffee and some sweets, and in about 20 minutes we will go on to the next session. So thank you very much. I apologize. so. And then we're hopefully ready and revitalized by coffee for our next session. Thank you to the three authors again. And now I'm very pleased to introduce Minister Tobias Billström, Minister for Migration and Asylum Policy in Sweden, to enter the floor and to give us some comments from your Swedish minister perspective. So please, very welcome to Forus.
Excellent. Thank you very much for the invitation to join you all. And this is not the first time I'm attending a Forus seminar on the subject of labor migration, and I don't think it will be the last either. This is a very, very interesting subject, and I think that the reason for us gathering here in this room to debate it is because migration affects us all. The question of freedom of movement is one of the key achievements of European cooperation. As we have learned from the authors of this very interesting book who made their presentations, Sweden decided not to introduce transitional rules for labor immigration at the enlargement of the European Union. And the discussion in Sweden in the years following the 2007 enlargement was, as is mentioned in this study, focused not on the fact that too many labor migrants may have come to Sweden, but rather that too few came. We had a very low input of people, very low inflow of people to Sweden from 2007 and onwards. And concerns about, well, an aging population and the fact that too few would be of working age is also in the context of the Swedish labor migration reform in 2008. This is still the case in Sweden, as the public debate is, well, focused on finding well-functioning systems for labor migration and not counteracting it, which might be one of the more crucial differences between the Swedish debate and many of the debates taking place in other EU member states. I think that it is also desirable for this freedom of movement to be extended to persons who can come to Europe to work or to study to a higher degree, not least in order to increase the attractiveness of Europe and thereby meet future labor needs. And the phenomenon on migration will very likely not disappear. People will always want to move for one or another reason. The global economic crisis will to some extent influence their decisions. That's also very clear from this study that this has been the case. But I'm certain that there will always be a need and a demand for migration, although there might be fluctuations over time, which is also to be expected from a historical point of view. So the conclusion of this should be that it is important for the EU to create easily understandable and attractive systems in the area of labor migration in order to remain competitive on the global labor market. After all, this study focuses a lot on the relationship between various EU member states. But let us not forget that we are all part of a global labor market, and this is something to take into context. So it is consequently important that member states are seeing increased mobility as something positive, both for EU and for countries of origin, even during an economic crisis. The demographic trend in Sweden and the EU reinforces the need for migration to Sweden. In order to be able to compete for international labor, Sweden must become an attractive destination for migrants. Migration cannot compensate for an aging population, that's quite clear from a national economic point of view. But migrants may be a welcome contribution to fill the gaps on the labor market. And many of the labor migrants may not come to Sweden with the intention of staying on here permanently, but rather with the aim of, well, staying a few years to gain experience and develop skills. An enabling legal framework that allows migrant workers to be flexible can be an important part of a policy to address the demands on the labor market related to the demographic change. Also, permit me a few words on the effects of the economy. According to the study by Professor Wadensjö, the results of studies concerning the effects of immigration on wages and unemployment in Sweden mainly shows that such effects are small and goes in both directions. And this could, according to Professor Wadensjö, be explained by migrants and citizens born in Sweden being not substitutes but complements on the labor market. I think that this is crucial, since it also gives support to the idea that an increase in the number of labor migrants can lead to an increase in the demand for labor, which is very interesting and something to be taken into account when we design policies on a national level. Well, you know that I presented a new goal for the Swedish migration policy when I took up my office 6 years ago, with the purpose to increase opportunities for labor migration in order to make it easier for employers to recruit persons from countries outside of the EU. And Sweden has gone indeed from a 40-year-old non-labor immigration policy to the most open and liberal system for economic migration in the entire OECD family. And the main reason behind this policy, our raison, to put it more clearly, of the government, is that there are labor shortages in Sweden that cannot be filled by persons living in Sweden or in other EU countries. Swedish employers have difficulties in finding employees with the right skills. The results of this is quite clear, not least from this study. The Swedish labor migration reform has not resulted in a massive inflow of labor migrants to Sweden, despite the open nature of the system. The relatively low influx can, in part, I would say, be due to the fact that the reform entered into force during a global financial crisis. But as this study highlights, other factors, such as language, migrant networks, and labor market structures, can also affect the influx, and this is something which we should continue to think about and talk about. Labor migration flows have increased somewhat over the past year, but it remains relatively small to the total employment entries. However, for a handful of occupations, such as computing professionals, labor migration provides a significant contribution to employment in our country, with India being top of the list, which is also interesting. Since it is now the employer and not an agency, public agency, who decides if and when there is a need to recruit labor, the Swedish system can respond to different economic climates and changes over time, which of course is one of the great advantages with this legislation compared to other more, how should we say, complex and more politicized systems where governments and public agencies make these decisions instead. Also, a few words on public opinions in Sweden. Sweden is an open country, and we welcome migration, whether a person comes to Sweden as a refugee or to work or to study. It is also an important point to make that the public debate in Sweden regarding migration policy is not overall characterized by xenophobia or anti-immigration opinions. On the contrary, I think that the debate in Sweden concerning labor immigration is mainly focused on the working conditions of these migrants while in Sweden, and the need to ensure that labor migrants receive terms of employment in line with Swedish standards. And this might also be something which singles us out from many other countries, both within the EU but also outside of it. Well, thank you for the opportunity to make these comments, and I'll yield the floor to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tobias. A quick question for you as well. One of the most, for me, one of the most valuable insights from the study was that there are so obvious long-term gains from migration for the sending countries, for the source receiving countries, and also for the single migrants. But on the other hand, there are the short-term negative effects are often more visible and tangible, which is well, a challenge for any politician to reach out with the message about the long-term gains. I mean, how do you do that? I mean, what is your? Is there any? Yes.
Well, yes. Thank you for the question. I think I could probably spend an hour or maybe a whole day talking about this subject, because, I mean, after all, you're working into the core of what it is being a Minister of Migration. But let me put it this way. The Swedish debate is somewhat different than the debate in many other European countries because of the makeup of our migrant population. I mean, after all, for 40 years, the one road that we had into our country was the road as an asylum seeker. And that has shaped the idea, the image, the public opinion about what a migrant constitutes. Now, when we are moving, as of 2008, in the direction of having a more diversified, more multi-class, if I may use the expression, system of roads for people to enter into Sweden, I think that we are embarking on a very important journey. A journey which might lead, in the fullness of time, to a complete change. We'll see that migrants can actually be not just people who are forced to flee their countries because they're being persecuted or pursued by governments or by other ethnic groups, etc., but people who choose Sweden of their own account because they feel that this is the right place to work in, with the emphasis on the word work, working. This is the one reason why they come. I think that this is therefore important. Also to see and to use in the political debate the reference which you made to development is very important, to realize that by allowing people into Sweden to come here and work, we also complement our policy of development and aid. And Sweden's participation in the project of the Global Forum of Migration and Development, which is ultimately going to lead to a very important meeting, the actual meeting of the forum to take place in the spring 2014 in Stockholm, where representatives of, I think, 160 countries in the UN family will gather to talk about migration and development, constitutes a very important symbol and sign of our engagement in this question. Development and migration are not two separate entities. They are more and more entwined because of the money that is being remitted back by migrants to their countries of origin, which in turn leads to increased living standards and ultimately to the, how should we say, building a larger and smaller world at the same time, with networks being constituted and developing in many countries at the same time, to the benefit of all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That responds to my very confused question. And now that leads us to our next speaker, which is the consul from the Polish embassy, also head of consular section here in Stockholm, Ms. Barbara Sotnicka, that will give us some comments from a Polish perspective. Welcome.
Thank you very much for having invited me. And first of all, I would like to stress how much I admire the work of our authors for this nice contribution to the discussion on migration in Europe. Also, I would like to be in with the point with my colleague from Poland. I would like to assure you that the Polish people are not going to invade the United Kingdom, Sweden, not at all. And the last publication this week of our main statistics office tells that last year more or less the same people left Poland. It's about 12,000 of Polish people who left Poland forever, and about 16,000 of foreigners came to live forever to Poland. So this is more or less the same. The only what is a little bit off conscious, it's the gap between the people who leave Poland temporarily. It's about 2 million, and those who come to live in Poland temporarily. So the gap is huge. But, you know, from my consular experience, I know that everybody of us would like to be rich, young, and beauty. So, no. And it's worth to see migration, I think, within the European Union countries as a phenomenon resulting from one of our fundamental freedoms within the European community, the free movement of persons. So viewed that way, it should be encouraged as a clear expression of a personal choice of each of us, EU citizen, where we want to live, when we want to work, establish our families, etc. And it's obvious, on the other hand, that this fundamental freedom does not deprive any destination country of the right to regulate migration inflow. Neither does it relieve any of the foreign labor migrants of the duty to respect such national legislations. And the consequences of labor migration within the European Union are obviously different from the source countries, such as Poland, I think, and for the destination countries, such as Sweden and the United Kingdom. I do believe that in the long run migration processes we are mutually beneficial, also not to the same extent and not in every aspect. That's why it's so important to study in depth the empirical material concerning migration within the EU countries, to be able to address the challenges and to take advantages of the opportunities that migration presents for the economies of the countries concerned. That's what makes this publication on labor migration all the more needed. So thank you very much. I wouldn't like, but I think I should, according to the most recent data, there are slightly over 2 million Polish citizens living temporarily abroad, and out of which is, of course, a vast majority chosen to migrate to another EU country. So the EU countries with the largest numbers of Polish migrants are currently the UK, Germany, Ireland, and the Netherlands. Sweden, despite of its geographical proximity, has not received a comparable in size migration away from Poland, as I mentioned the countries about. Starting after 2004, there are more or less, as we can estimate, because you know it's quite difficult to count person by person, but more or less 30,000 people. Talking that Poland is a traditional source country, maybe yes, but we have to remember that my country, at least from the late 19th century, is a migrant country because of the complexities of our history. And even the reality is changing very rapidly, and Poland also turned into a destination country for many labor migrants in recent years. I would like to share some knowledge with you that, for example, when the Polish people started migrate in the late 19th century, when I came here and I was trying, you know, to count more or less the Polish people living in Sweden and trying to imagine the waves of inflows to Sweden. I discovered there more or less 3,000 of people came here to Sweden, Denmark in the late 19th century. And then after the First World War, almost everybody returned to Poland. And after statistics we can recall, there were just about 100 people living before the Second World War in Sweden. Well, I'm not going to tell in the stories about the history after. And after Poland's accession to the EU in May 2004, as it's commonly known and appreciated in my country, 3 countries have opened their labor markets to Polish citizens without any restriction, and it was the UK and Ireland and Sweden. But also I would like to stress that mostly there are a lot of high educated people who left Poland. In Sweden, for example, we've got more than 1,000 of doctors. So I think that it should be quite a yellow lamp for my government to think of it, because, well, we are losing the power and the labor force in the future. The experience from 2 of these countries are, of course, the subject of the interesting studies and has been put into a publication which we have known today. And I hope that these countries of research will receive indeed due part of attention from both the academic circles and as well as the authorities that are responsible or involved in the designing or carrying out migratory policies. So we should bear in mind that in the time of crisis, which has dawned over much of Europe in recent years, many anxieties and worries are expressed with more vigor and less qualms. So it includes obviously the issue of migration. For many people, the benefits of labor migration are not obvious, maybe, and sometimes overshadowed by fear of unequal competition or pressure on the local welfare system exerted supposedly by the foreign migrant workers. But it should be our constant duty, I think, to promote sound knowledge based on this kind of empirical study, which demonstrate what is a real image of migration within the European Union and what is a gain or lose balance for each EU country. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Sosnicka. Would you say you started your comment with well, a humoristic remark about trying to say that you won't invade us, you won't invade the old member countries, but jokes aside a little bit, is that an attitude that you think still remains in some countries, that there's a enormous an attitude of a Polish invasion?
No, we are not. No, I just make a joke because I would like you to present you the last data of our statistics office. So we've got 20,000 people who left, but 16,000 who came to live permanently in Poland. So the gap is not so huge, I can imagine, in the terms of demographic, quantities and qualities. And my joke about invasion, of course, it was just a joke.
Thank you very much. Now I'll ask Anna to help you to switch microphones, and now it's time for our last couple of speakers, and I would like to welcome first Ms. Katarina Nowak from the Federation of Swedish Forestry and Agriculture Employers. Very welcome. And Magnus Lindberg, who is an ombudsman at the Swedish Union of Forestry, Wood and Graphical Workers. And I'm very curious to hear about how your organizations have engaged in a dialogue on issues on labor migration. And I'll start with giving the floor to you, Katarina, that I know are very interested in the issue of labor migration, very important to the sectors you represent, with some comments on the study, and then go on how you handle possible disputes and issues on this area. So very welcome.
Thank you. Ladies first. Thank you for inviting us to this, or at least me, to this very interesting seminar on a topic that is very important for our branch of business. And this study that I read is very interesting as well, and I have a little suggestion, at least for Mr. Wadensjö in the end, afterwards. I would like to describe for you what my organization represents. We have 4,000 members and around 26,000 employees that work within this branch of businesses. It's mostly small enterprises, and they exist in rural areas. And we have a high degree of seasonal employment in our branches of business, and the work is also considered as low paid. Something that is characteristic of our companies is that we don't move abroad with the production. We can't roll up the forest, fold it, unpack it and the farmland and go to Germany and unpack it there. We have to work in Sweden as we exist in the land, in the countryside. We need labor as a workforce. We can't have a mechanism, machines. We have to have laborers, workers working with in our companies. And we have difficulties in finding these people in Sweden. Therefore, we are very dependent on people coming from other countries to work for our companies. And Polish workers are very common in our branches, of course, and then the Baltic countries comes as number 2. As for Sweden, we have been a receiving country for hundreds of years. It started with Queen Christina, as I remember it, when she imported people from Italy who froze to death when they were working here. And we have both skilled and unskilled workers to thank for the development in Swedish business and areas, both in businesses and in culture, actually. So a lot of things that we think are Swedish from the beginning actually comes from skilled workers coming to our country, developing things. And what has been written in this book has not made me change my mind on that topic. I think it's very important for us to have people coming from other countries to work for us. And I also noticed the remarkable difference between UK and Sweden due to labor regulations and labor market structures, what that makes as a difference in wages and what kind of work that the people work with in the two countries. But I also think, as we are dependent on short-time work, this study mainly concentrates, as I can see it, on longer periods of times that people stay in Sweden, or forever. They stay forever, they become citizens in Sweden. In our branches of business, we have a lot of seasonal workers, and I would like you, Mr. Wadensjö, to make more research on that subject. What kind of impact does that kind of short-time work has on wages, work environment problems, xenophobia, and that kind of thing? That I would really like to have more light on those problems, actually. And that could be both domestic countries employing people from other countries. That should not be a problem, as we have collective agreements, but posted workers and workers working for entrepreneurs coming to Sweden. That would be really nice. But good integration of migrating people needs knowledge of mechanisms and social life. And as a small country, Sweden needs the skills from other nations, actually. And how do we work to meet problems that occur when we import labor force to Sweden? Because there are problems, actually. It's not only gold and green forests, as we say in Sweden. It is problems that occur. And apart from negotiation, because then when we have trouble, we start negotiations and see how do we solve the actual problem. We cooperate in a policy group that is ruled by the Swedish tax authorities, and the policy group consists of the social partners, and it's also people from the police and from the tax authorities, and also representatives of the different branches. It's not only the forest workers, it's also people working with the agricultural and gardening business that take part in this policy group. And we also, apart from that policy group, that we work with these problems and discuss how should we prevent problems, how should we cooperate to take away difficulties so people can understand the regulations in Sweden and so that people work in a correct way. That's the purpose of this policy group. No black work, everything should be white and that kind of thing. And with Kommunal, that is the union for gardening and agricultural workers, we also have an ethical group. And this ethical group is formed so that when the unions, because it's always the unions that see the problems first, when we have the problems, when they occur, they get in touch with us, and then we see, is there anything that we can do to stop this problem and to solve the problem before it gets something that will be bad for the branch? Because this is also public relation for our companies. If we work in an incorrect way, people do not want to come to us and work within this branch of industry. And as a concrete example of what we have done in this policy group, there is a guideline that is on our website, where we inform of what should you consider when engaging a person from another country. And that can be both as an employee, and if you engage an entrepreneur, what should you think about? What are the regulations? Or if you use what do you call that? Posted persons, employment companies, yeah. So, and this is also a way for us to help our members to do things correctly. And as we are very concerned about people not being members in our organization, we also have this guideline on a special website that we call Klarsignal, or Green Light, which we own together with social partners, and we put everything that we have a common opinion on this website. So I think that's a very constructive way in working. So maybe I should leave the word to Mr. Lindberg.
Yes.
Do you represent...
You'll have to excuse me, I speak with fewer words than Katarina, and slightly slower, but I'll do my best. I'll start with the saying that I was glad to hear that Katarina actually said that there's lots of low-paid jobs in the forestry. We'll have to do something about that in the upcoming negotiations. So, let's see, that's number one, making a joke. All done now. I have to, in this case, agree with Katarina in everything she said, actually. So maybe we can type it out, this complete entire speech, and put it on the website. Yes, I don't know. Yes. Since we agree on it. I'm not sure how much more there is to say in the subject, because as we have different interests. Our organizations, there are of course a lot of things that we don't agree on, and I think the way we see it is that it's a healthy and normal situation, and a part of the Swedish model. So
you mean to engage in dialogue? That's a part of.
Yes, there is a part of. Although we disagree in the specific cases where people have been coming here as migrant workers and didn't receive the pay that they should according to the collective agreement, we still have sound and healthy negotiations, I think. And from our point of view, that is the most important thing, because my trade union, which is I didn't say GS, it's for the graphical wood and forestry and graphical wood and forestry workers. I mostly work with forestry, so our point of view is not to be how do you say, migration is here to stay, and we will in the future need to some extent people coming from abroad to do the work in forestry. That is a fact, and we strongly believe that the best way to secure working conditions for people in our line of business, our branch, is by collective agreements. So that's a good reason to discuss these issues with SLA. The proper way to solve problems is not to speak. You have to speak with your opponent.
You mentioned earlier that you're a quite small labor union, but then I know you've been working as a regional ombudsman, so I guess you get pretty close to your members. What would you say is the most common worry among them when on issues on labor migration?
Actually, I think Tobias pointed it out quite nice earlier, that the debate among our members is not the fact that people think that it's troublesome that there's competition coming from other countries. People worry that the migrants coming here are not treated as they should be. Their terms is not okay sometimes. Of course, the majority of people coming here is treated fairly, but some people aren't, that's for sure.
I mean, now you mentioned it, and Katarina, you've been mentioning it to me earlier, that the importance of actually talking about labor migration, would you say that this is something that maybe other sectors have bigger problems in doing? I mean, we've seen quite big debates and controversies. Why is your sector different? Let's put it like that.
Because we're such nice people.
Yes, absolutely.
No, I think that we see the problem, and we have a representative from the building and constructors organization as well. They work very hard together with their unions as well. But I think that I believe in dialogue, and I believe that we have to create attractive working places to attract people, and to do that we have this Swedish model. We have unions and we have employers, and that we have to find a way to solve things, and there are actually certain topics that we do agree on, and that we have to have a sound competition, and sound competition in Sweden very often becomes sound when you follow the rules and the regulations. And we know that education, vocational skills are very important, and a good environment for the people working in the wood, because our employees are outside. They don't have a house where they are sitting and working. They sit out in the woods or on the fields. So that's why we have to concentrate on other kind of topics regarding the work environment. So that's to create these attractive workplaces. We have to work hard, and we have to work together with the unions, because if we fight all the time, we fight sometimes, but if we fight all the time, we won't achieve anything. So that's and I suppose we have understood that as partners.
Let me give you an example of something that we discussed earlier today at lunch. When I was a regional ombudsman, I had a contact with a few migrants from Poland working in the midst of Sweden, you might say. One of their problems was, this is seasonal work. You have to remember, brushing in the forest is a seasonal work that ends September, October, November, maybe sometimes, some years. They had stayed here for more than a year, so they had the right to unemployment, A-kassa, unemployment. Yes, yes. Their intention was to stay in Sweden for the whole time and to study SFI, Swedish for immigrants, during the winter time. But they couldn't get any support, A-kassa, because in Sweden the rules I'm sorry, I will say A-kassan again, is actually that you can't combine it with studying in any way, even though they were doing the studying nighttime. It wasn't possible to combine, and I think that's something that the government should actually take a look at, because it makes it harder for migrants to take jobs that we need to have done in this country.
And this is very important, I think, because one of the best ways to learn another language is to learn it by working. So it should be possible for these people to learn Swedish when working or having A-kassa. I agree. We agree there.
Yes.
Thank you very much for this. I think we're summoning up this afternoon as night falls over Stockholm. And I saw Eskil, you took notes from Katarina's recommendation there, so we're creating very nice synergies here. Now I'd like to welcome everyone that has been up here to answer some questions from the audience. Don't be shy, and we're a small and impressive group. So yes, Anthony in the back. I think we can make it without microphones, maybe.
Do you want me to say something from here, or do you want me to?
Oh, please step forward.
Thank you very much indeed. Minister Karen, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Anthony Rowlands. Put that down there. I'm Executive Director of Centre Forum, and I'd firstly and primarily like to thank particularly Karen. This is a partnership, but she's done 98% of it, and we're very grateful to you and to the authors for contributing to this excellent book. The United Kingdom has just hosted the greatest international event that happens, the Olympic Games. Only two things went wrong. One, Mitt Romney came and said we weren't ready, and he lost. And secondly, a company called G4S, who were meant to provide lots of workers for the Olympics, got into an unholy mess. I do notice that this building is protected by G4S, because they're little labels on the window. But more seriously, in terms of the issues that you've been addressing, we now have a coalition government. We're getting used to it. We haven't had one before in peacetime, and it's between the Conservatives and Liberal Democrats. Centre Forum is an independent Liberal think tank, so we are not part of any party, though it so happens that many of us are Liberal Democrats. I'm a Liberal Democrat. I'm a Liberal Democrat councillor, so quite close to what goes on. And it's a fascinating period in our history, and in fact migration and immigration and related issues are one of the main points of tension, undeniably. Within the Conservative Party there is a tension that exists between those who are rather sceptical of the value of immigration and those who represent business, many of whom realise its importance. So you've got tension within one component of the coalition, and then you've got between the two parties, because I'm proud to say I think the Liberal Democrats have taken a much more progressive view about migration. Not unrealistic, but seeing it as fundamentally a good thing. And I suppose just if I come round to a question, because you want questions, don't want me to stand here till 4 o'clock. Fascinated by much that Martin said, and my apologies, I got here a bit late. That was to do with Air Norway, and I think I can say that without offending too many people in the room. But we do have serious problems, and just to focus on the youth issue, we have very high youth unemployment, particularly among white working class youth, and that there lays one of the main challenges of trying to provide them with the skills, because as Martin portrayed, it is often the case that employers turn around and say, who will provide me with a better employee? It won't be the young man of 22, and we have to do something about that. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank
very
you
grateful.
For being here. I don't know, Martin and Eskil, does anyone have any Tobias question to the panel? Now, we had some experts down there doing research on migration policy as well. You don't have any comments or remarks? Yes, sir. Welcome.
I didn't want to do this. Charles Wilson from Remesso, Linköping University. We're an Institute for Migration Research Studies. Thank you, everybody, for wonderful presentations. It's very exciting. I'm from the UK as well, but I've been in Sweden since 2010. And what is so exciting about being here is that this is a moment of transition and change. And in part, the Minister has outlined some of those changes. We are particularly interested in what is happening to posted workers in Sweden, something that my colleague from Stockholm says we need more information on. That's something that the FAS Research Council has given us money to look at here in Sweden. Part of the problem is, and I address my comment to the Minister in the first instance, that employers please excuse me, I'm sure you're a good employer. But employers in some sectors of Swedish industry are remarkably inventive in finding ways to find their way around the Posted Workers Directive and the appropriate regulations. And increasingly, although we are looking at this and we need to document it and quantify, increasingly this is our impression that this is increasingly the case. And that's very, very worrying indeed, because it points towards the creation of segmented dual labour markets in which incoming migrants are being, not just occasionally, but systematically open to exploitation and abuse. Now, my second point is this. With regard to the migration reforms, and yes, I think it's a very bold and courageous experiment, the evidence from the OECD would appear to suggest that there is an almost parallel danger of the segmentation of migrants from third countries into low-skilled occupations, particularly where the reach of trade unions and the social partners is weak and becoming increasingly so because trade union density is declining in Sweden. And it seems to me, as an outsider from Britain, that one of the most remarkable things that Sweden lacks is a dedicated labour inspectorate with powers of enforcement, scrutiny, and indeed the power to mount prosecutions on errant employers who are abusing workers. Now, I don't want to mention berry pickers here. I'm sure that's a very sensitive topic to our colleagues out there. But really, has not the time come to think about new structures of enforcement and protection that will defend the rights of migrant workers, particularly, and I know this is bad news for the trade unions, but particularly as the ability of the labour market actors to police the labour market in an effective way is becoming less over time. So that's my question.
Well, thank you very much. So that I guess it was a question directed to, well, the three of you. It's as I take your question, you say that this new inflow of migrants kind of poses a challenge to the Swedish model where unions, yes. So would someone like to start? Yes,
if I may. I'm not sure if I know the correct way to say it in English, but the rumor of our death is not it's not an actual fact yet. So let's start there. Personally, I believe that the system with the collective agreement in Sweden is the best one. You say posted workers. In our business, posted workers is
It's not that common.
No, it's not that common. Most people, migrant workers coming to Sweden to work in forestry, I don't know all that much about agricultural work, but they are here working under a Swedish collective agreement. That is the usual case.
Or employed by a foreign entrepreneur. But mostly those entrepreneurs comes from Europe, not third countries. If I may add something, we have one problem that we really don't know how to solve, and that is sometimes if you come farther away from Sweden in third country nationals or third countries, very often there is a system of people buying employment contracts and agents, and I don't think that's a serious business. That's criminals mostly, and I really don't know how to deal with that, and I don't think you know either. The only thing we can talk about for our customers to entrepreneurs, so those who buy these services, is maybe to have a better control of what they're buying, but sometimes that's very difficult to control systems in, for instance, Western Africa, Thailand, Burma, and that kind of country. So how to solve that, I'm not really sure, but the only thing we can do is try to protect our system and try to have a good dialogue between the social partners here, because I think what we're talking about there, where people really can suffer, that's a police matter, because very often that's a criminal thing, offense, actually.
thank you very much, and Mr. Billström as well.
Yes, is this on? Yeah. Well, thank you very much. Are you sure about that?
I guess you have to scream.
Yeah. You know, some years as a politician has made me quite sensitive to microphones that are not working. Anyway, well, thank you very much for your question. I think that this is something which is interesting to talk about from 2 points of view. First of all, when we are addressing the question of labor migrants and the rights of labor migrants, I think it's essential to understand that what we did in 2008 was to provide people with a new legal route to enter into Sweden. Now, this legal route makes it possible for people who before perhaps resided in Sweden or entered Sweden illegally to actually have a platform if they are abused, a platform to stand on from which they can complain to authorities and use the police to enforce their case, but most essentially to get in touch with trade unions who can operate and work their case, which you can never do when you are an illegal or irregular, you can use whatever expression you want, migrant on a territory. This is the really interesting difference between then and now. You can never root out all problems on a labor market. There will always be those employers who try to circumvent the existing legislation, those employees who try to bypass the system in another way. But if you offer people a platform to stand on, at least they can advocate their case if they are being abused. And this brings me to another important observation, and both Katarina and Magnus have touched upon it. If you today are abusing the system, there are already legislation in place. Trading with working permits is a criminal offense. That's already written into the legislation. If the police finds out that you are dealing with that, you can be prosecuted, brought to justice, and it's not only fines, there are also prison in the list of legal punishments. And last but not least, which this is something which you perhaps would like to add some comments on, but since you were mentioning berry pickers, no, I don't find that a sensitive subject at all. I think it's something which we really should talk about. In 2009, after the legislation had come into place in December 2008, yes, we had a very major influx of people who arrived as berry pickers. I think it was 7,500 all in all. And yes, during that summer there were some incidents being reported, some very unfortunate incidents. Some were of a purely criminal nature, people running off with the cash of the company and so on, but also people who didn't receive the wages which they had been promised, etc. The Swedish Migration Board then, under the existing legislation, changed in collaboration with trade unions and the employers' associations, the way they worked the system. And that led to a significant decrease of errands. The year afterwards, 2010, saw only about, I think it was 4,500 applications. And yet there were some instances, so they made some further alterations. And in 2011, we saw only about 2,500 berry pickers arrive in Sweden. But this year, when the Migration Board closed the books, we had saw an increase again to about 5,000, if I'm not very much mistaken. And yet I haven't, as far as I know, seen one single case being reported in media, at least, you may know more than what I do, about significant problems. Nothing like the things we saw in 2009 and 2010. And though there might be instances, I think that this shows that our legislation is not only strong enough, but also that the authorities have found ways to do their job in collaboration. And I have to say that I spent some months in 2010 when I was Minister of Labour, together with being Minister of Migration, talking to Ms. Anneli Nordström, who is the chairman of Kommunal, and also, of course, to Katarina and other representatives of the Employers Association. And I find the attitude very inspiring. There was so much, I should say, good nature measured attitude towards trying to weed out those who circumvent the system. But at the same time, everybody stood up for the migration legislation as such. And this, I think, was very inspiring. Thank you.
I know we have a representative from the employers in the construction sector. Was it a direct answer to the question, or because Mr. Bruce also?
My name is Linda, and I'm from the representative from the Swedish Construction Federation. And we do have a lot of questions.
Including 4 countries regarding, it's not functioning, regarding postal workers, 3 receiving countries, Norway, Denmark and Sweden, and 1 sending country, Poland. And we are just completing the study, and it will be published a few months in 2013. So it's, I think it's quite interesting what we have done. So we are a little bit sales promotion for that report. It will be published by the Nordic Council.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Minister, Ms. Consul, to the authors. Unfortunately, Ms. Wojcicka had to leave for her flight. Thank you so much, Katarina and Magnus, as well, for coming here, and to the audience. And in Sweden, each year that they always name the Christmas gift of the year. And before this launch, I heard it was going to be headphones. But after today, I'm most certain that it will be this book. And you can help us make that happen. So please take copies of the book and give it to someone you love for Christmas. And thank you so much, and hope to see you here again. Thank you.